The HBO studio lights blazed down on the Real Time with Bill Maher set. As the host leaned forward in his chair, a practiced smirk playing across his face. Seated to his right was Hollywood legend Robert De Niro, arms crossed, his famously intense gaze fixed on the young woman across from them. Karoline Leavitt, the 27-year-old former White House press secretary, sat poised in a tailored navy suit, seemingly unfazed by the heavyweight political and entertainment figures prepared to dissect her on national television. "So, Karoline," Maher began, his voice dripping with condescension. "You're what, about 12 years old and somehow ended up as press secretary? Tell us, was there a take-your-daughter-to-work day that just never ended?" The audience erupted in laughter as cameras caught De Niro's amused nod. It was clear from the start, this interview wasn't designed as a fair exchange of ideas, but as an ambush of the young conservative figure. What happened next would shock not just the studio audience, but millions of viewers. In the span of 15 minutes, the confident mockery from these two media titans would transform into something no one expected. Genuine emotion that transcended political divides and revealed the true power of authentic communication. This wasn't just another political confrontation. It was about to become one of the most surprising and humanizing moments ever captured on a political talk show. Before we dive deeper into this remarkable exchange, take a moment to subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next analysis of today's most pivotal political confrontations. Bill Maher had built his career on biting political commentary and taking down opponents with razor-sharp wit. At 68, the veteran host of Real Time had spent decades cultivating his image as an intellectual provocateur who prided himself on challenging guests from both sides of the political spectrum. But critics had noted his increasing tendency to give liberal guests an easier ride while reserving his most cutting remarks for conservatives. Tonight's show was particularly significant for Maher. After a ratings dip and criticism that he'd lost his edge, the producer had secured both De Niro and Leavitt for what promised to be compelling television. The seasoned Hollywood liberal icon versus the young face of the new conservative movement. Robert De Niro, 81, needed no introduction. The two-time Academy Award winner had become almost as famous for his outspoken political views as for his legendary acting career. In recent years, he had become increasingly vocal about his opposition to conservative politicians, often making headlines with blunt, unfiltered comments on cable news and late-night shows. For De Niro, this appearance represented another opportunity to voice his concerns about the direction of American politics. He had already dismissed Leavitt in pre-show publicity as just another talking head reading from a script, and made it clear he viewed her as representative of everything he believed was wrong with modern political discourse. Across from these, two established figures sat Karoline Leavitt, whose rapid rise had become a political Cinderella story that fascinated both supporters and critics. At just 27, the New Hampshire native had already served as an assistant press secretary in the Trump White House, worked as communications director for House Republican Conference Chair Elise Stefanik, and run a competitive congressional campaign, before becoming one of the youngest White House press secretaries in American history. For Leavitt, the stakes of this appearance were enormous. Dismissed by critics as too young and inexperienced, she had faced constant challenges to her credibility. Tonight's interview on a show watched by millions, most of whom didn't share her political views, represented both significant risk and opportunity. A poor performance would confirm her critics' claims that she was out of her depth. Holding her own could transform her public image. "Let's be honest," Maher continued as the opening segment moved forward. "Most press secretaries at least pretend to be adults. Your generation still needs help setting up a Wi-Fi router, but suddenly you're qualified to speak for the White House?" The audience laughed again, though less enthusiastically this time, as some viewers at home began to perceive the age-based attacks as unnecessarily personal. De Niro leaned in, his iconic voice gravelly with conviction. "I've been in this business for over 50 years. I've seen people come and go. What bothers me is the lack of substance. It's all performance, no depth. When I was your age, I was studying, learning, paying dues. Now it seems like anyone with the right connections and a good camera presence gets thrust into positions they're not ready for." The camera panned to Leavitt, who maintained remarkable composure despite the coordinated critique of not just her politics, but her very legitimacy as a professional. The audience waited for her to crack under pressure or respond with defensive anger, the typical reactions Maher expertly provoked from guests. Instead, Leavitt smiled slightly, took a measured breath, and began a response that would dramatically alter the trajectory of the evening. "Thank you both for having me on tonight," Leavitt began, her voice steady and unexpectedly warm. "I appreciate the opportunity to have this conversation, even if we're starting from different places." The simple civility seemed to momentarily catch both men off guard. They had prepared for defensiveness or counterattacks, not gracious acknowledgement. Maher, quick to regain control, interjected, "Different places is putting it mildly. You're defending policies that would have been considered extreme even by Republican standards 20 years ago, all while barely being old enough to rent a car." The audience chuckled, and Maher pressed his advantage. "Let's talk about your qualifications. Your generation gets mocked for needing safe spaces and trigger warnings, yet suddenly you're supposed to handle the pressure of the global media. Help us understand that leap." De Niro nodded in agreement, adding, "I've spent my life trying to understand characters, to get inside their psychology. What I see in politics today is people playing roles without understanding the gravity of what they're doing. It's like a bad actor who memorizes lines but doesn't understand the character or the story." The coordinated assault continued for several minutes. Maher pulled up embarrassing screenshots from Leavitt's early career. A minor gaffe during a press briefing, an awkward TV interview moment. De Niro spoke about the serious business of governance being reduced to social media performances. The studio audience, predominantly liberal, responded with appreciative laughter and occasional applause. Throughout this mounting pressure, Leavitt maintained her composure, taking notes and nodding occasionally. When Maher finally turned to her with a dismissive, "Your response to all of this?" the studio fell into an anticipatory hush. Everyone expected either a rehearsed defense or an emotional reaction, the two outcomes that would validate the premise of the segment. "You know," Leavitt began thoughtfully, "growing up in a small New Hampshire town, my parents taught me something important about respect. They said it isn't automatically owed to someone because of their age or achievements, though I genuinely admire both of yours." She nodded to both men. "They taught me respect is earned through how you treat others, especially those with whom you disagree." She turned directly to De Niro. "Mr. De Niro, I've watched your films since I was young. The Intern was actually one of my favorites because it showed the value of intergenerational workplaces, how wisdom and fresh perspective can complement each other when there's mutual respect." The reference to one of De Niro's less critically acclaimed but warmly received films caught him visibly off guard. It wasn't the response of an angry ideologue, but of someone who had genuinely engaged with his work beyond the obvious classics. For qualifications," she continued, turning to Maher, "you're right that I'm young for this role. Every day I feel the weight of responsibility it carries. But perhaps there's a perspective worth considering. Throughout history, young people have fought wars, led movements, and changed nations. The average age of soldiers on D-Day was 26. The founding fathers were largely in their 20s and 30s. Dr. King was 26 when he led the Montgomery bus boycott. Her tone remained conversational rather than combative. "I don't mention these to compare myself to historical figures, but to suggest that perhaps we should judge people by their capacity and character, rather than just their birth year." The audience, expecting fireworks, instead found themselves listening intently to an unexpectedly thoughtful response. "You mentioned my generation needing safe spaces," she continued, addressing Maher directly. "It's a fair criticism of some campus cultures. But consider this. I've stood in the White House briefing room facing hostile questions from 50 seasoned journalists, with millions watching, knowing a single mistake could create an international incident. Whatever else you might think of, me or my politics, that room is the opposite of a safe space." A ripple of unexpected laughter, appreciative rather than mocking, moved through the audience. Even Maher's expression flickered with what appeared to be reluctant respect. De Niro, however, was not yet ready to concede ground. Talk is easy, he said, leaning forward. I've watched young people come into Hollywood for decades thinking they're ready for the big time. Most aren't. Most haven't done the work, haven't developed the substance. In my day, you studied, you prepared, you earned your place. Now everyone wants to start at the top. It was a direct challenge, and the audience tensed, expecting the conversation to finally devolve into the heated argument they had anticipated. Instead, what followed would transform the entire tone of the evening. Leavitt looked directly at De Niro, her expression neither intimidated nor confrontational, but genuinely thoughtful. You know, Mr. De Niro, there's something powerful in what you just said that I actually agree with completely. The unexpected agreement momentarily disarmed both host and guest. De Niro's eyebrows raised slightly in surprise. The idea that we should earn our positions through hard work, preparation, and substance. That's a deeply American value that transcends political differences, Leavitt continued. My grandfather worked in the same factory for 40 years. He had a high school education but read voraciously. He taught me that nothing worthwhile comes without effort and preparation. She paused, then added with surprising vulnerability, when I was appointed press secretary, the first thing I felt wasn't pride. It was fear. Fear that I wouldn't be prepared enough, studied enough, or strong enough for the responsibility. So I did what my grandfather would have done. I prepared. For months before my first briefing, I studied 18 hours a day. Policy briefings, historical precedents, constitutional law, economic theory, international relations. Her voice remained steady, but her eyes revealed the emotional weight of the memory. I set up mock briefings where colleagues attacked me with the hardest questions imaginable. I studied every press secretary before me, from both parties, to learn from their successes and mistakes. I called Sean Spicer, Jen Psaki, and Karine Jean-Pierre, asking for their advice despite our political differences. The studio had fallen completely silent, the audience captivated by the unexpected sincerity. The day of my first briefing, Leavitt continued, I carried my grandfather's worn copy of the Constitution in my briefing binder, not as a prop, but as a reminder of the weight of the role and the preparation it demanded. She turned back to Maher. You can disagree with my politics. That's the beauty of democracy. But please don't assume I haven't done the work or don't understand the gravity of the position I hold. That assumption doesn't just dismiss me. It dismisses the millions of young Americans who take their responsibilities seriously, whether they're serving in our military, teaching in our schools, or yes, working in government. The authenticity of her response created a palpable shift in the studio atmosphere. This wasn't rehearsed talking points or defensive posturing, but a genuine window into the human experience behind the political persona. Even viewers who disagreed with her politics could recognize the sincerity. De Niro, whose career had been built on recognizing and portraying authentic human emotion, was visibly affected. For a moment, his practiced media persona fell away, revealing something unexpected: recognition. The same intensity that had earlier conveyed disdain now reflected a reluctant but genuine respect. You know, he said, his voice softening slightly. I came up in a different time. When I was starting out, there was this unspoken understanding that you had to put in the time, pay your dues. It wasn't always fair, but it created a certain humility. He paused, seemingly surprised by his own candor. It's easy to assume the younger generation hasn't done that work. Maybe that's not always fair. Maher, sensing the conversation moving in a direction he hadn't anticipated, attempted to redirect. That's all very touching, but let's get back to the actual policies you're defending, which many would argue are, but De Niro, in a surprising move, held up his hand to interrupt the host. Hold on, Bill. I want to say something here. The rare assertiveness from the typically reserved actor silenced Maher immediately. The audience leaned forward, sensing something extraordinary was happening. I've spent my life trying to understand people's motivations, to find the humanity in characters that might seem difficult to relate to, De Niro continued, looking directly at Leavitt. It's easy in our current climate to forget that behind political positions are actual human beings with their own stories and journeys. His voice grew contemplative. My own grandfather came through Ellis Island with nothing but determination and a belief in what America could be. Different time, different circumstances from yours, but that spirit of wanting to contribute, to have earned your place. I recognize that. The famous intensity in De Niro's eyes now carried a different quality, not anger or dismissal, but a genuine emotional resonance that caught everyone, including Leavitt, by surprise. The camera caught a hint of moisture in the legendary actor's eyes. "We can disagree strongly on policy," he continued, "but I was wrong to question your preparation or sincerity. That was unfair of me." The admission, coming from a man famously reluctant to concede ground in political discussions, fell like a thunderclap in the silent studio. Maher, visibly uncomfortable with this unexpected turn toward mutual respect, attempted once more to regain control. "Well, this is all very Hallmark Channel, but—" "No, Bill," De Niro interrupted again, his tone firm. "This matters. We've lost something important in our discourse. The ability to see the humanity in those we disagree with, to recognize sincerity and preparation even when we fundamentally differ on conclusions." He turned back to Leavitt. "I still think many of your administration's policies are deeply misguided." A hint of his familiar intensity returned. "I'll continue to speak out against them. But I was wrong to dismiss you personally, to assume you hadn't earned your position or didn't understand its weight." The camera caught Leavitt's expression, genuine surprise giving way to respectful appreciation. "Thank you, Mr. De Niro," she said quietly. "That means more than you know." Maher, now visibly frustrated with the loss of the confrontational segment he had planned, made one last attempt to salvage his original vision. "Fascinating as this mutual admiration society is, let's remember that policies have real consequences for real people, regardless of how earnestly they're presented." Leavitt nodded. "You're absolutely right about that, Bill. The stakes of these disagreements are incredibly high. That's precisely why the quality of our discourse matters so much. We can be passionate advocates for our positions without demonizing or dismissing those who disagree." She looked from Maher to De Niro and back to the host. "In fact, I'd suggest that's exactly what we owe the American people. Vigorous debate on substance, rather than attacks on age, credentials, or presumed motivations." The audience, which had arrived expecting entertainment through conflict, found themselves witnessing something far more compelling, an authentic human connection that transcended the expected political battle lines. The spontaneous applause that followed wasn't for a partisan point scored, but for a moment of genuine communication that had become all too rare in American public life. As the segment concluded, the camera captured something remarkable: De Niro quickly wiping away what appeared to be a tear before extending his hand to Leavitt in a gesture that signaled not political agreement, but human recognition. And Maher, for perhaps the first time in his long broadcasting career, found himself momentarily speechless as he witnessed the power of authentic dialogue to transcend even the most carefully orchestrated confrontation. The impact of the unexpected exchange between Leavitt, De Niro, and Maher reverberated far beyond HBO's studio. Within hours, clips of the conversation began circulating widely across social media platforms, garnering millions of views and triggering discussions that crossed typical partisan boundaries. The moment when De Niro acknowledged Leavitt's preparation and sincerity became the most shared political clip of the month, with the hashtag respectful disagreement trending nationally for nearly 2 days. The unexpected emotional depth of the exchange clearly resonated with an American public increasingly exhausted by the performative hostility that characterized most political discourse. Conservative media outlets, which had prepared to highlight what they expected would be unfair treatment of Leavitt, instead found themselves celebrating what many called a breakthrough moment in political communication. One prominent commentator noted, "Leavitt didn't just hold her own against two liberal heavyweights, she transformed the entire conversation by refusing to engage on their confrontational terms while never backing down from her core principles." More surprising was the reaction from progressive publications. "Last night's Real Time gave us a glimpse of what political discourse could be," wrote a columnist for a major left-leaning outlet. Not because anyone changed their policy positions, but because they momentarily set aside the dehumanizing assumptions that make genuine communication impossible. Media analysis programs dedicated segments to examining how Leavitt had effectively changed the game by responding to personal attacks with substantive, personal authenticity rather than defensive counterattacks. Communication experts noted how her references to her grandfather and her preparation process had shifted the conversation from abstract political positions to shared human experiences. For Bill Maher, the aftermath was complicated. While the episode generated his highest ratings in 3 years, it also prompted soul-searching about his interview approach. In a podcast appearance the following week, he made a rare admission. I had a whole segment planned to essentially paint her as an unqualified kid in over her head. She completely disarmed that by being more substantive and authentic than what I had prepared for. It was humbling. De Niro's public response came through a surprisingly candid interview with The New Yorker. I've been vocal, maybe too vocal, sometimes, about my political concerns, he acknowledged. But that exchange reminded me of something important I'd forgotten. That behind political positions I find deeply troubling are real people with their own journeys and genuine convictions. He added with characteristic frankness, I still think her administration's policies are wrong for this country. I'll keep saying that, but dismissing someone because of their age or assuming they haven't done the work, that was my mistake. Good acting requires recognizing authentic human emotion when you see it, and what I saw from her was authentic. Perhaps most significantly, the exchange sparked conversations across dinner tables, classrooms, and workplaces about the possibility of disagreeing politically without presuming the worst about those on the other side. Several universities reported using the clip in courses on political communication, rhetoric, and civil discourse. For Leavitt personally, the appearance transformed her public image far beyond her conservative base. While critics continued to disagree with her policy positions, the dismissive, just a young talking head characterization largely disappeared from mainstream coverage. Profiles in major publications focused on her preparation process and background, treating her as a substantive political figure rather than merely a youthful curiosity. 3 weeks after the appearance, Leavitt and De Niro made headlines again, when they appeared together at a bipartisan forum on restoring civil discourse in American politics. Though they maintained their profound policy disagreements, their joint appearance symbolized the possibility of engaging across political divides with genuine respect, if not for each other's conclusions, then for each other's humanity and sincerity. In his introduction at that event, De Niro demonstrated how deeply the exchange had affected him. Throughout my career, he said, I've prided myself on being able to recognize authenticity. Yet in our polarized climate, I realize I've sometimes failed to see it in those with whom I deeply disagree. That failure isn't just a disservice to them, it's a disservice to our entire democratic tradition. Leavitt's response captured why their exchange had resonated so powerfully with millions of Americans. Our republic was built on the idea that we can vehemently disagree about policies while still recognizing each other's fundamental dignity and good faith, she noted. We've lost sight of that distinction in recent years, assuming policy disagreements must reflect character failings rather than different priorities or perspectives. Restoring that distinction doesn't require abandoning our principles, just remembering the humanity of those with whom we disagree. As the media cycle eventually moved on to the next controversy, something of the moment's impact remained in the cultural conversation. A small but significant reminder that even in America's most divided era, authentic human connection could occasionally transcend the battle lines of partisan politics. Not because anyone abandoned their core beliefs, but because they momentarily set aside the dehumanizing assumptions that had made genuine communication so difficult. In a political climate defined by manufactured outrage and calculated attacks, the unscripted authenticity of a young press secretary, a legendary actor, and even a reluctantly humbled talk show host had offered a glimpse of a different possibility, one where disagreement didn't require dismissal, and where seeing someone's humanity didn't mean surrendering your principles. If you found this analysis of the remarkable exchange between Karoline Leavitt, Robert De Niro, and Bill Maher insightful, don't forget to like and subscribe for more. in-depth coverage of today's most significant political moments. Share your thoughts in the comments. Do you think authentic personal communication can help bridge America's political divides? Or are our policy differences simply too fundamental? Your support helps us continue bringing you thoughtful analysis of the evolving political landscape.